You probably walked past someone like Della Voss and didn't think twice. Most people do. She's 23, standing outside a freight rail yard in Tacoma on a Wednesday morning in January, wearing a barn jacket that wasn't originally hers, and copper-red box braids gone orange at the ends from weeks of Pacific Northwest sun. What little of it there is. She's got a beanie pulled low over her ears, and she's looking at a curved piece of corrugated galvanized steel, like it owes her something. That's because it does. She found it propped against a chain-link fence on the far edge of the encampment, half buried in mud. Someone had dragged it off a construction demo site, 2 blocks over, and left it. Nobody in camp wanted it. Too heavy, too awkward, no obvious use. It wasn't a tarp. It wasn't a tent. It wasn't anything anyone knew how to turn into shelter in an afternoon. Della wanted it. The other people at the encampment, there were 31 of them at the time, sleeping in a collection of dome tents and blue poly tarps, and one retired pop-up canopy that had already lost 2 of its 4 legs. Most of them had been out there longer than Della had. 7 months was roughly the average. Some had been on that rail yard edge for over a year. They'd watched tents die. They knew what Pacific Northwest winter did to nylon and aluminum poles and budget waterproofing. They'd seen the full cycle. New tent comes in, lasts 1 bad storm season, starts leaking at the seams, pole snaps in a windstorm, gets patched with whatever tape is available, gets patched again, 6 weeks later, finally collapses into something nobody sleeps in anymore. Every single person in that camp had gone through at least one version of that cycle. A few had gone through it 3 times. So when Della started dragging that curved metal sheet toward her spot on the east side of camp, a few people watched. Nobody helped. One guy, a wiry 40-something named Grant who'd been out there 11 months, said she was going to hurt herself. Another woman laughed. Not mean, just the kind of tired laugh people give when something looks futile and they've seen too many things fail to get excited about a new attempt. Della didn't say much back. She just kept pulling. What she was looking at in that curved piece of corrugated metal was the skeleton of a Quonset hut. She'd seen pictures of them a few weeks before on a borrowed phone, looking for anything that wasn't a tent. The Quonset hut design goes back to World War II. The American military needed a structure that could be shipped flat, assembled fast, and survive conditions that would tear through a conventional building. It's a half-cylinder, or corrugated steel arched over a simple base. No center ridge, no poles running up the middle. The arch is the whole point. An arch distributes weight along its curve rather than concentrating it at a peak. Rain doesn't pool on it the way it does on a flat surface. Wind can't get the same grip it gets on a vertical flat wall. Snow slides off instead of sitting and loading. What Della understood, what most people standing in that camp didn't, was that a tent fights the weather. The Quonset arch works with it. That's a different problem to be solving. She didn't have a plan in any formal sense. No blueprints, no measurements written down. What she had was 2 more pieces of galvanized corrugated steel she'd spotted leaning against a dumpster 3 days earlier, behind a commercial building that was mid-renovation. A clear memory of those Quonset photos on that borrowed phone. A roll of wire she pulled from the camp's shared supply pile, and about 4 hours before dark. She also had, though she wouldn't have framed it this way, the kind of focus that comes when you need a solution badly enough that waiting for someone to hand you one stops feeling like an option. The first thing she did was pace out the footprint. She wanted enough interior space to sleep fully stretched out, to sit up without hitting her head, and to keep her pack and her few possessions dry and reachable without digging through a pile. That meant roughly 7 feet long, 5 feet wide, 4.5 feet at the peak. Not big. Nobody was building a cabin. But she'd watched people in camp build structures that were too large. Wide tarp setups that caught wind like sails and came down in November in a tangle of cord and wet nylon. She'd seen what too much surface area costs you in a Pacific Northwest windstorm. She drove 4 stakes into the ground at the corners using a flat rock and a piece of rebar she'd found near the fence line. Then she started bending the first corrugated sheet into the start of the arch. Corrugated steel resists bending across its ribs. The ribs are the whole point, structurally. They're what gives the sheet stiffness, but it will curve along them if you work it slowly and apply pressure evenly. She'd learned this by accident the week before, trying to flatten a smaller piece for something else, and noticing which direction the material was willing to move. That's all it took. Pay attention to what the thing in your hands is trying to do. The second sheet overlapped the first by about 4 inches at the curve. She wired them together, wrapped the wire around the overlapping ribs, twisted it tight, Pull it snug, move to the next point, repeat. It's not elegant. It doesn't need to be elegant. It needs to hold. The third sheet closed the back wall and formed the partial front, leaving an opening she could duck through without difficulty. It took her most of 2 afternoons, working alone. The first night she slept in it, it rained. And here's the thing about that first night. The thing that actually mattered. She stayed dry. Not drier than before dry. Not mostly dry. Dry. Her sleeping bag came out of that night the same as it went in. No damp patches at the foot, no condensation working through from a leaking seam. The arch sent rain off to both sides, and the overlapping wired seams held because the curve itself was pressing them together. There was no pole in the center to buckle under a gust. There was no waterproof coating to fail at the seams. It was steel. Rain hit it and ran off. That was the full mechanism. In the morning, 2 of the dome tents on the west side of the camp had small puddles inside. One had a collapsed center pole. Wind had hit it at the wrong angle overnight. The woman in the pop-up canopy had stacked 2 tarps over the top of it before she went to sleep and still woken up with wet gear. Grant walked past Della's structure on his way to the water station. He slowed. He looked at it for about 4 seconds, and he kept walking without saying anything. That was mid-January. By the end of February, camp had gone through 2 more wind events, the kind that come in off Puget Sound, with no warning, sustained lateral wind, sometimes gusting, the sort that finds the gap between a tarp and the ground and lifts the entire structure in one motion. 3 tents came down in the first event. 2 more went down in the second. People were cold. People were wet. People were spending their mornings after a storm, rebuilding things that had been working fine 3 days before, restaking, repatching, trying to bend a snapped pole back into something usable. Della's structure didn't move. She'd added to it by then. She'd found a piece of plywood behind a building supply store 2 blocks north. They threw out damaged sheets, warped ones or ones with corner splits, and she'd taken one from the pile outside their dumpster. She laid it as a floor, elevated slightly off the dirt on 2 salvaged 2x4s she'd found the same week. The floor mattered more than almost anything else, she added. Ground moisture is what destroys sleeping gear over time, especially foam pads and synthetic fill. It works slowly and invisibly. You don't notice it the first week, maybe not the second. And then one morning your pad feels heavier and your bag smells like mildew, and you realize something has been soaking up from below for weeks. Della had learned this the wrong way her first month out, sleeping directly on a ground pad on packed dirt. The floor was the fix. She'd also added a piece of foam camping mat cut to fit the interior of the sleeping end, a wool blanket she'd gotten from a church donation box 3 blocks away, and her pack positioned across the bottom of the opening as a partial windbreak for nights when the wind was coming from that direction. The inside of the structure, even on the coldest nights she'd spend in it, stayed noticeably warmer than the air outside. Not heated. Nothing was heated. But metal mass holds whatever warmth builds up inside from body heat, and the arch eliminated the drafts that flat-walled shelters always have, the gaps where wind finds a corner or a seam and pushes through. People in camp started asking questions around the 3rd week of February. Not immediately and not all at once. The way it happened was gradual. Someone would walk past, slow down, look at the structure, look at their own setup, and walk away without saying anything. Then they'd come back 2 days later with a specific question. The first person to ask directly was a 25-year-old named Marcus, who'd been at the camp about 4 months and was on his 3rd tent, the first 2 having failed at the seams, which is the most common failure point on budget tents because the waterproof tape inside the seam is always the first thing to go. Marcus asked what the curved metal was called. Della told him about Quonset huts, told him about the arch, about how the shape itself solves the rain problem rather than just trying to repel it, about how an arch routes force downward and along the curve so that there's no single weak point. Marcus listened the way people listen when they're already half convinced but want to hear the full thing before they commit. He went away. He came back the next day with a piece of curved sheet metal he'd found on the far side of the freight yard under a section of fence that had been replaced and the old pieces left in a pile. Della helped him build his version. It was smaller than hers. He'd found less material and couldn't source a 3rd sheet the same week, but he got a functional arch, 2 sheets wired together, and covered the open front face with a piece of tarp he already had. It wasn't the same as Della's. The curve wasn't as complete. There was more gap at the base on one side. It was enough. The next significant rain came 4 days later, and Marcus was dry for the first time in 2 months. That's the thing about a working solution in a place where most things stop working. It doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to work one time while something else fails. That's the whole sales pitch. By mid-March, 4 more people in camp had built some version of what Della had built. None of them were identical. An older man, mid-50s, had been in the encampment close to 2 years, built a version with a rough wood frame supporting a single curved sheet, more of a lean-to with an arched roof than a true half-cylinder. It wasn't as solid as a full arch. It was substantially better than the tarp he'd been under, which had been losing its UV coating in strips for the past 6 months and was effectively translucent in places. Another woman in camp named Priscilla found 3 longer sheets in a single haul from a demolition site a few blocks east. She built something nearly 6 feet long, weighted the base perimeter with salvaged cinder blocks to stop any lifting from wind, and ran a bead of silicone caulk along every exterior seam from a partial tube she'd sourced from a hardware store that was getting rid of old product. Priscilla's version was better than Della's original. Della said so directly when she saw it finished. That's worth sitting with for a second because the easy version of the story puts Della at the center of it, as the one who figured everything out, and everyone else as followers. That's not accurate to what happened. Or what Della had was the first working version, and the willingness to build it when nobody else thought it was worth the effort. What happened after was a camp full of people who are, by plain necessity, skilled at solving problems with limited materials. Who took a structural idea they'd now seen work and adapted it to their specific situation, their specific spot in the encampment, their specific available materials. Some of those versions turned out better than Della's first build. That's how useful ideas travel. What Della's structure specifically had by April, 3 months after she built it, was this: 0 weather failures. Every tent in camp had required at least 1 repair since January. 2 tents had been fully replaced. Her structure had not been touched in any meaningful way since she finished wiring the second overlap in January. The corrugated galvanized steel doesn't rust on the fast timeline people expect. Galvanization is specifically designed to slow corrosion, which is why it's the standard material for agricultural outbuildings and construction applications where a structure is going to sit in weather for years without maintenance. The wiring she'd done was not clean work by any standard, but wiring on a curved surface held under compression behaves differently than wiring on a flat seam held under tension. The geometry compensated for the technique. Erbil also brought 2 things the camp hadn't fully prepared for. The first was a sustained warm stretch that turned the encampment's drainage situation into an active problem. When ground stays wet for 3 weeks and 36 people are walking the same patch of earth every day, it stops being soil and becomes something closer to soft clay. Several tents that had made it through winter without issues started sinking at their staked corners as the ground loosened. One woman's tent floor was sitting in standing water inside the footprint despite the outer shell being intact. The stakes had tilted inward, and the base had sagged enough to collect. Della's structure sat on the plywood floor, off the ground, mud underneath it, not in it. The second thing was a visit from a city outreach office, someone with a clipboard doing a welfare assessment of the encampment. Not enforcement, not a sweep. He walked the site, made notes, asked a few questions about how long people had been there, what the access to water and sanitation looked like. When he got to Della's section, he stopped walking, he asked who built it. She said she did. He asked how old it was. She said 3 months. He crouched and looked at the wired seams, at the plywood floor sitting on the 2x4s, at the overhang she'd added at the front. He stood back up and wrote something on his clipboard. He said he'd seen worse construction on structures with permits. It's not a warm compliment, it's an accurate one. He was looking at something that had been built to solve a problem, not to impress anyone, and had solved it well enough that he had to note it. By May, she'd made 2 more additions. The first was a small overhang at the front opening, a scrap piece of flashing bent at a shallow angle and wired to the top of the arch entry. It deflected rain that would otherwise blow through the opening at an angle during storms coming from the south. Before she added it, a south wind event meant wet gear near the front of the sleeping area. After, it meant nothing. The second addition was a section of old yoga mat she'd gotten from a gym that was throwing out worn equipment. She cut it to fit and pressed it against the inside of the roof on the sleeping end. Metal surfaces develop condensation when warm air from inside hits cold steel from outside, especially during the temperature swing nights common in Pacific Northwest spring. That condensation drips. It's not rain, but it gets sleeping bags wet the same way rain does. The mat stopped it. Both additions cost her nothing except the time to find the material and work out the fit. That part tends to make people uncomfortable in a specific way, not the building itself, the part where it works better than the things that cost money, or a decent four-season tent, the kind rated for actual winter conditions with a waterproof rating that holds past one season, runs $300 or more. The dome tent from a discount outdoor retailer, the kind most people in the camp were using because it was accessible and affordable, runs $60 to $80. And even the $80 tent has a service life in wet, wind-heavy conditions that's measured in months, not years, because the coated fabric degrades and the poles are aluminum tubing that fatigues at the bend points. Della's structure, in terms of materials she paid any money for, zero. The corrugated steel was construction salvage. The wire was from the camp's shared pile. The plywood was thrown out refuse from a supply store. The rebar was construction debris. The 2x4s were scrap. The flashing was a scrap piece. The yoga mat was discarded gym equipment. What it cost was attention and time. About 6 hours of actual labor spread across 2 days and several weeks of paying attention to where usable materials appeared. The reason it's worth being specific about that is because the common framing around homelessness and resourcefulness tends to treat ingenuity as a personality trait, something some people have and others don't, or something that explains why one person makes do and another person doesn't. That framing is comfortable because it locates the variable in the individual rather than in what information and options were actually available to them. Della didn't build a Quonset-style shelter because she's extraordinary. She built it because she saw a piece of curved steel, remembered a picture she'd seen on someone's phone, and understood enough about the shape to think it might work. The information was there. The material happened to be available. She put them together. The reason most people in her situation don't do the same thing isn't a deficit of resourcefulness. It's that the Quonset solution isn't in the information stream that reaches people who are unhoused. Tent solutions are. Tent donations happen through organizations. Tent guides exist on outreach websites. Tent distribution programs exist in most mid-size American cities. The tent industry is a real commercial market with manufacturers, distributors, and retail channels. And all of that infrastructure means tents are what people think of when they think of portable shelter. There's no Quonset hut industry serving the encampment market. There's no margin in curved corrugated steel salvage. So nobody recommends it. Nobody distributes a guide about it, and the information just doesn't travel in those channels. Grant found this out himself. The man who'd told Della she was going to hurt herself when she started dragging the sheet metal in January. In March, when he finally asked her directly how the structure worked, he admitted he'd never heard of a Quonset hut. He was 40 years old. He worked in commercial construction for 9 years before he lost the job. He'd spent almost a year sleeping in a tent in Tacoma. He'd never heard of a Quonset hut. That's not a failure of intelligence or curiosity. It's just what doesn't get passed along when the information only moves through channels that are trying to sell you something. After Della explained it to him, he spent a week looking for material. He found enough for a partial structure, not a full arch, but a curved roof section he could integrate with a wooden frame he built from pallets he broke down on the far edge of the yard. It wasn't the same as Della's. It was the most weather-resistant thing he'd had in 11 months. By the time June came around, Della had talked through the basic concept with at least 8 people in camp. Not a lesson, not a demonstration. Just the conversation that happens when someone asks how something works, and the person who built it actually explains it. She'd drawn a rough diagram for Priscilla at one point, the arch cross-section, the overlap seam, the floor elevation, on the back of a receipt. Priscilla kept it folded in her jacket pocket. The situation that got Della out of the encampment had nothing to do with the shelter. She'd been on the waiting list for a family housing program for 4 months. A unit opened in the second week of June. She got the call on a Tuesday morning. She packed what she had, which wasn't much. She'd been deliberate about that, not accumulating more than she could carry, not building dependencies on the physical space beyond what she needed. Her sleeping bag, her pack, the wool blanket, a few other things. She left the plywood floor. She left the yoga mat on the inside of the roof. She left the flashing overhang. She left the structure. The question of whether to dismantle it before she left came up, practically speaking, because the materials had value in the camp's shared economy. Corrugated steel, wire, plywood, these were things people needed. She could have taken it apart and redistributed the pieces. She thought about it and decided against it. A structure standing is worth more than its components scattered. Marcus was still there. Priscilla was still there. New people came through the camp regularly, people who'd never seen a Quonset arch, who'd arrive with a dome tent and no idea what was coming. In November, a standing structure that worked was more useful than a pile of materials. She told Marcus not to take it down before she left. He said he already knew. After what she didn't know, leaving that Tuesday, was how long it would actually stand after her. She'd built it in January. It was June. 5 months. The galvanized steel wasn't going anywhere soon. That's the nature of the material. The wiring was holding. The plywood floor was intact. The overhang was still deflecting rain into the correct direction. She found out later through a mutual connection that someone new had moved into the structure in July. Someone who'd arrived at the camp after Della was gone, who'd never met her, who hadn't watched her drag the sheet metal across the camp in January. They'd simply been shown to an available spot and found a structure there. They just knew it didn't leak. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who haven't spent time in a place where most things stop working. A shelter that doesn't leak, that doesn't collapse in wind, that doesn't require repair after every storm. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. Sleep is the foundation of every other decision a person makes. Every job application, every intake appointment, every conversation with a caseworker or a housing coordinator. When you're not sleeping dry and not sleeping warm, those things get harder in ways that are concrete and cumulative. Della wasn't thinking in those terms when she built it. She was thinking, the tent is failing. There's a piece of steel. The shape might work. Let me see if the shape works. It worked. 5.5 months by the time she left. The dome tent she'd had when she first arrived at the camp, the one she used for the 3 weeks before she found the corrugated steel, had a broken pole by week 2 and a seam leak at the left rear by week 3. She put it in the camp's shared pile when she switched to the Quonset. Someone tried to use it. It lasted another 2 weeks of actual use before it wasn't viable for anyone. That tent had cost $74. There's a version of this story that makes it about Della's particular cleverness. That version is more comfortable for most people to receive because it makes the outcome feel exceptional. Something that happened because of an unusual person. Not something that could be replicated by most people in a similar situation with similar materials in a few hours. The actual version is less dramatic. She saw curved steel, remembered a shape, tried to build toward it, and succeeded at a basic structural level on the first attempt. The Quonset arch is not a complicated design. It's old precisely because it's not complicated. What she had that mattered wasn't cleverness. It was the willingness to spend 2 afternoons doing something that everyone around her had already decided wasn't worth trying. And then the arch held.